They are friendship's canyons, citadels to brave men, suburbs built of cement, and Winnebagos. Some dwarf the rolling hilled hamlets that contain them. Kings are crowned here. Legends are born here. And for every fantastic finish, there's another story, as old as the asphalt and mortar of these shrines of speed themselves, the tale of the men that built them. February 1959, and the beaches of Daytona were filled with northern snowbirds. But this year, there would be one less activity on the hard-packed sands. 11 years of NASCAR racing on the beach had gone out with the tide. Only the consistent pounding of the surf remained. The newest attraction was now 5 miles inland. After months of toil, sweat, and counting pennies, Bill France was ready, on time, to open the gates of his speed palace. For many, the first sight of the brand spanking new Daytona International Speedway evoked awe.
It was just super humongous. We got ready to go run, and Johnny Bruner Sr. was the flagman. He looked after the race part of it, and he said, y'all go out and you got to run 5 laps on the flat before you ever get up on the bank. Okay, you know, here I'm a 21-year-old kid, and I go out and I run through 1 and 2 and around 3 and 4 and probably through 1 and 2 again. I said, nah, I'm gonna get up on the bank. Got up on the bank. I was the first person that was black flagged at Daytona Beach.
NASCAR's competitors had a new lightning-fast proving ground. The 31-degree turn-banking accelerated speeds beyond anything they'd ever experienced, and for the first time, the word drafting appeared in their vocabulary.
Well, I'm not sure that they knew what drafting was the first race. If they did, they didn't realize, that it would be so great.
Once you get up right behind them, you could just back out of the throttle. It just drag you along. So, because the wind current was coming off their car and over top your car, and it's coming down the deck and it's pushing you along as well as keeping it off your nose. So you had the best of two worlds, really.
As drivers learned their way around the huge 2.5-mile tri-oval, the weeks of testing and time trials whetted the fans' appetite for the upcoming 500-mile contest. Behind the scenes, the entire NASCAR organization was firing on all cylinders to make sure race day was a success.
My job at that time was just working the track, getting the parking. We took most of the parkers from the beach. The National Guard used to do the park from the beach, and they did it out there for the first time.
Today, the inaugural race at Daytona is fondly remembered as storybook. There was Chamber of Commerce sky blue weather, a celebration of sporting Americana, and a packed house, 42,000 strong, all assembled to watch the best stock car pilots that the East, West, North, and South had to offer, each with the one-time chance to write his name on the first page of a new chapter in motorsport's immortality. The green flag was just the first historic moment. From their high vistas that afforded a view of the entire facility, fans witnessed passing, pit stops, and pulsating speeds. The first 450 miles of Daytona were captivating to watch, even for young Richard Petty. After falling out of competition early, he hastily joined the crew of his father, Lee. The two-time NASCAR champion was in a lead-swapping battle with Johnny Beauchamp. It was a favorite Southern son against the outsider. For 50 laps, they traded both paint and the lead. Up in the makeshift press box, typewriters were clicking just as fast. This would make great page one copy. On the final lap, they headed for the finish, Petty and Beauchamp. From his perch, Bill France watched them close. Only a few yards remained. France's pipe dream was making real history. But the gods of racing couldn't let this one go without one of their special twists. With less than one Daytona 500 turn remaining, a dead heat finish formed with Lee Petty in the middle between a low Johnny Beauchamp and a high but laps down Joe Weatherly.
And they were running side by side. And France Sr. was standing in the gate and says, "I'll make this call." And he called Beauchamp the winner.
The idea of a photo finish after 500 miles of racing caught everyone off guard. No one had thought to place a camera at the line. All 12 journalists, polled by Daytona Beach News Journal sports editor Benny Kahn, thought Petty won. Petty thought Petty won. Rumors began to circulate that Bill France had picked the wrong winner intentionally.
The cow that was the Daytona 500 was milked for the better part of a week by Bill France. Bill had a flair for publicity, and he milked it to the utmost, and I don't blame him.
We were looking for footage. We got a lot of footage, but if the angle comes, if it's the wrong angle or is off just a little bit, then it looks like maybe a different car won than really did.
Well, he was smart in one way because he was trying to get Ford involved in racing, and he figured if Ford won, then they were liable to come back in racing. But he got lucky because we got to be on the pages of the newspaper and stuff for 3 or 4 days there of arguing about it. So really he come out on top, and we did too.
Let's see if he can do it. He's going to do it. Jeff Gordon wins the California 500.
The blueprint for a modern stock car facility will always be Daytona. And now approaching the end of the 20th century, Bill France's vision looms large as a NASCAR building boom is underway.
I remember standing over on Merrill Avenue on the overpass with Roger Penske in July of '94, and he says, "This is where we're going to build this speedway." And I said, "Boy, we got to have vision."
France's foresight in design and construction is still the foundation on which these modern multi-purpose complexes are built. Architects are charged with the mammoth task of creating not only a competitive circle of asphalt, but one ringed with the most luxurious suites to house corporate America's high-powered CEOs.
We need the great arenas to keep pace with the NFL and the NBA. We need places like California and Texas Motor Speedway and Las Vegas. I mean, all these new venues. And it all started with Daytona. I mean, that was such a vision right there. And for somebody to have that type of vision to do that and to see it be as successful as it has been, it doesn't surprise me at all that the whole sport has gotten to where it is. But, you know, every sport needs a Super Bowl, and ours is Daytona. There's no doubt that the biggest win in my career has been the Daytona 500. You know, you can win championships, you can win a lot of races, but until you win the Daytona 500, your career really isn't complete.
Well, the cars are forming on the track for the Southern 500. Many of the old-timers are on the ground. Before the race, Jackie Stewart asked many of today's favorites what they were doing on the day of the very first Southern 500.
I was running around in the pits just watching everybody go. I was 12 years old at that particular time. I was about 9 years old, Jackie, and I was back in the mountains of North Carolina picking corn, I guess.
My mother was probably changing my diapers about the first time this race was run.
Well, I was in the infield down, I had a babysitter at that time, down in the far end down there. My dad was racing in the race.
Daytona was not the first of its kind. That distinction belonged to a South Carolina track, one whose design was also inspired by Indianapolis, and one whose most notable landmark was the imposing guardrail that wrapped around turns 3 and 4 of the original layout. Centrifugal force pinned many cars up against it, and no one could complete a race without scraping alongside it for the better part of the afternoon. For many young men, Labor Day brought the Southern 500 via the radio airwaves, and along with it, a dream that they too would one day wear the Darlington stripe.
I guess the first time I heard about it was just listening to the races, on the radio. And of course, I'd be out under a shade tree or something, working on an old car, and hear them talking about like running Darlington. The Darlington stripe, rubbing the guardrail to get around it, running about 130 miles an hour or something like that. And I said, boy, them boys are crazy, doing something like that, rubbing a wall, running that fast.
Darlington had been built nearly a decade before Daytona, but its original purpose was not for stock cars, rather open-wheeled Indianapolis-type machines that grabbed the attention of Harold Brazenton on a fateful trip up north.
It was not built to be a stock car track. It was built to showcase the Indianapolis cars.
I got in the car, a few friends of myself, and we went to Indy. Well, after I saw what I estimated about 200,000 people, I just couldn't believe all those people to go to see a race. So after watching the Indy cars run and the Speedway team, I got to thinking that a stock car race, it showed the mechanic and the bookkeeper and the lawyer and the doctor and everybody would take a very big interest in it.
Darlington was scheduled to open in 1950, but Brazenton was about to get a big lesson in promoting. Unlike the movie script, he built it, but no one was coming.
They got down to within a short time in front of the events, and they had hardly any entries. So Harold Brazenton called my father and asked him if if NASCAR could come in. And it was really on short notice. Maybe I'd say 6 weeks, could have been a month. But in any event, he said yes, and we had 75 cars, took the green flag that day, and it's been a stock car track ever since.
While Big Bill was in the garage sorting out the enormous number of entries, his son was putting his salesmanship skills to work.
Even Bill France Jr., who was there, he had a snow cone concession, and he ran out of syrup, but he still had ice, and so he was yelling, "Snow cones plain, and he sold a lot of them.
They qualified and started 75 cars in that very first race, 3 abreast. From the start-finish line, there was so many cars in that race. They went through the 4th turn, almost all the way to the back stretch. That's how many cars started. And when they dropped that flag on that first lap, it looked like about 2,000 New York taxi cabs trying to go on that first turn to be in, first. But we run on the inside of the track, and man, it was like running on sandpaper. I blowed 22 tires in the first Darlington Southern 500, but I think Johnny Mance was driving the little light Plymouth, had truck tires on it, and he finally stayed out there long enough. I think 5 or 6 hours that race lasted, the first one, and Johnny Mance won that first race.
The first Southern 500 was actually a co-sanctioned race by NASCAR and the CSRA, an open-wheeled racing organization. Brazenton did not give up on his vision to see open-wheeled cars compete at his track. In 1952, the Raceway hosted the first NASCAR open-wheel Speedway division race, which was won by Buck Baker. The division was short-lived, lasting less than 2 seasons, as was Darlington's flirtation with open-wheel racing. With the first Southern 500, the era of the superspeedway had begun for NASCAR, and with it, the attention of the national media. The 1950s brought waves of reporters from the Northeast and Midwest bent on covering the latest in the factory-supported wars out of Detroit. However, the media facilities were less than desirable.
It was an old, open, rickety, wooden chicken coop that stood, hovered, I say, about 15 or 20 feet off of the first turn, or outside the first turn, and the thing was scary. Just to be in it is inherently scary because when you first went in, you were concerned that those cars barreling down the front straightaway were going to make the first turn or not.
I walked up the steps and a Boy Scout was standing there with a cardboard box, and as I turned at the top of the steps, he handed me a pair of plastic goggles. I looked around, the front row was vacant. All the other press guys were sitting on the back rows, and I said, "Them fools sitting way back there, you can get down here close, you can sit on the front row." So I sat down on the front row, and I heard them all laughing, but I didn't know what they were laughing about. About 10 laps into the race, I understood why they were laughing, and I understood what the goggles were for, because my face was covered, and I turned and looked around at the guys behind me, and they all had their goggles on. Their faces were covered with soot. It looked like a group of minstrels sitting back there.
The headlines generated from the chicken coop boldly told of the brawn and the brains of the early cockpit pioneers who tried to tame the lady in black. Their copy included 3-time Southern 500 winner Herb Thomas and Speedy Thompson. Fireball Roberts certainly got a stripe or two on his way to victory lane. 1952 winner Fonty Flock made Bermuda shorts all the rage. The box scores reflected marathons of speed and endurance, all classic columns in what today still reigns as the longest-running Labor Day racing tradition. Nobody could drive a race car like Curtis Turner.
The best driver that we ever had was Curtis Turner. Curtis Turner would lose a car on a dirt track more times than you can count, and it never wrecked.
Nobody lived life like Curtis Turner.
I was in the airplane with Curtis Turner one time. I'm looking out the window, the prop stops, and I yell, scream. I said, whoa, the motor just died. He'd shut the motor off, I didn't know that. He's playing games. So then he tilts the airplane and he opens the door and he's trying to shove me out of it.
And nobody took chances like Curtis Turner.
He lived walking that high wire and without a net. That was Curtis. I accused him one time of having suicidal tendencies. So he was just like that nature. He did things that was so uncalled for. He kind of lived his life as a race driver, as a human being that way.
He once told rookie Cale Yarborough, "If you don't like this party, stick around. There's going to be another one starting in 30 minutes." Curtis Turner was a man with a foot in two worlds. There was Curtis Turner the racer, an icon at the end of the first era of stock car racing, and then there was Curtis the entrepreneur. He had been approached by promoter Bruton Smith to lend his name to a massive project, the building of a new super speedway in Charlotte, North Carolina. But the problem set in as the first shovel of dirt turned.
Between the first and second turn in the infield, there was a sort of a rock mountain that was 40 feet above the track. But down on the north end of it, between the third and fourth turn, was a 60-foot hole.
I remember that getting it finished involved opening an excavation school in the infield, where they figured they'd kill two birds with one stone by teaching people how to blow up rocks and take them out of there and get paid for doing that.
I thought to myself, I said, gee whiz, these guys, he has taken on a real mountain out there, because they didn't have any money. I mean, they were selling stock out of the trunk of their cars for $1 a share. And it just, it was a formidable challenge, and the fact that it was built was pretty amazing.
As the day for the first race approached, Bill France and company arrived at a track that, in spite of crews working 24 hours a day, was not finished. Guardrails at some areas had been put up just a day before, but that was way ahead of the track's surface, which would be finished the morning of qualifying. During practice, the track began to break up. Chunks of asphalt were flying as fast as the driver's mouths. In an ironic twist, the racers summoned the help of some unlikely allies in an effort to get the race postponed.
Jack Smith was one of the star drivers then, and he coaxed me into getting into his race car on the right side where there was no seat, and I was squatting down there holding on to the roll bars, and he wanted to show me how bumpy the track was and how rough it was, and he scared the life out of me. Morning of the race, my headline in the Spartanburg Herald was the World 600 with a question mark, and the story was prediction that the race would not reach the halfway point. And I arrived at the racetrack and walking up the wooden steps of a hastily built press box, looked up and there's this giant of a man standing in the doorway, blocking it, and it was Bill France. And I looked up at him and he had my newspaper with a headline on it, and he says, "Foster, we're going to run 600 miles here. And when this race is over, you're going to eat this newspaper.
France was right. They went the distance, but the race was not a competitive success. Tennessean Joe Lee Johnson won by 4 laps. The track was already $500,000 in debt and would not be able to satisfy its creditors' demands. The board of directors wanted Turner out, but Curtis had already embarked on a course to keep Charlotte under his control. It was a plan that would shake NASCAR to its foundation and would lead to the night Bill France came to the track armed with more than his determination. If Curtis Turner was a man straddling 2 eras, his sport was as well. Shortly after the first World 600, Turner approached the Teamsters about a loan, $800,000 to be exact, in exchange for unionizing the drivers. He organized a federation of professional athletes promising higher purses, a pension plan, and better insurance. Turner claimed to have signed membership forms with most of Bill France's drivers. All of those men were in Winston-Salem for a race at Bowman Gray Stadium. The next day, Bill France was too.
He got up in front of all the drivers and said he was going to close every one of his racetracks, had a pistol, and he said, I can use it. And it scared everybody to death that was on Curtis's Turner's side. And I was working for Curtis, and I more or less stuck along with him, and every driver quit because they were scared of Bill France closing all the racetracks.
France banned Turner and Flock from his sport for life. They sued, demanding reinstatement and $300,000 in damages.
The Daytona judge wouldn't listen to anything. Hoffa had all these Hot Wheel lawyers down there, and the Daytona Beach lawyers just beat the heck out of them, and we lost the case. And Bill France said, okay, Curtis, Tim Flock, you're banned from NASCAR racing for the rest of your life.
Legally, the Teamsters could not organize a company in which they had a financial interest. Case closed. Union busted. And a few years later, France's resolve softened.
One day, Bill called me in his office down in Daytona, and he said, Jim, come back here. And he said, you remember Curtis, don't you? I said, well, how can I forget Curtis, you know? And we sat down, and they were having a jovial talk. In fact, they were having a little drink together and celebrate. And he said, Curtis is going to come back racing. And he and Curtis were just as close as they'd ever been before that incident happened earlier.
Well, you wouldn't believe this, but Curtis Turner hadn't been in a car in 4 years. And the very first Rockingham race, Curtis Turner shows up down there and wins that race after 4 years.
A young competitor from Timmonsville, South Carolina, had the best view of Turner's win by finishing second to his idol.
As far as I'm concerned, Curtis Turner is one of the greatest natural race drivers that ever lived. And he was just tough. And just to be on the same racetrack with Curtis Turner was a thrill for me.
Turner's impact on the sport of stock car racing is still felt today. He was a hard charger. He was a man brave enough to stand up to Big Bill France. And he ended his driving career a winner. Befitting his lifestyle, it was in the cockpit of a crashed airplane that Curtis Turner lost his life at the age of 46. Tim Flock's life sentence was also lifted, but he opted not to return. Instead, he accepted a job at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, which was still a work in progress.
The track had never been finished, and I brought a designer in, a landscape designer who done theme parks and big things. And I asked him to look at the place and what do we need to attack first. He said, I can't do anything with it. He says, it looks like early beer can.
The Charlotte Motor Speedway has evolved from early beer can to vintage wine. At the Revolutionary Speedway Club, perched high atop the front stretch, patrons are served 5-star meals on fine china. Fans and sponsors and the media are treated as very important customers.
We were the first that added an elevator, and everybody thought, wow, an elevator at Speedway. So just all those things. And of course, when I decided to build the condos, my idea was it's just a great extension of a tailgate party, really.
4 decades later, Jim Foster's question mark is now the Coca-Cola World 600. NASCAR's longest contest, occupying its own tradition-filled Memorial Weekend date. Smith's Racing Real Estate Holdings are a credit to the lessons earned at Charlotte. His Atlanta Motor Speedway has been remodeled to rival her North Carolina twin. Gone with the Wind is the original 1960 layout. The swapping of straightaways now generates lightning speeds witnessed by the largest crowds in any sporting event in the state of Georgia. Not content with just super speedways, Smith purchased the Bristol Racing Bull Ring from Larry Carrier in 1996. In 1979, a capacity crowd would barely tip the scales at 15,000. Now, over 120,000 fans come to Tennessee's Thunder Valley to watch NASCAR's best pull no punches on the half-mile High Bank Oval. When searching for a site to construct a new superspeedway from scratch, Smith chose the 8th largest market of Dallas, Texas. Residents will tell you that everything is bigger and better in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Motor Speedway is no different. Opening in April of 1997 at a cost of $130 million, the facility rides tall in the saddle with the most suites and a seating capacity second only to Indianapolis. But the most prized possession of these bastions of concrete and asphalt is a NASCAR Winston Cup race date. A coveted position on the Winston Cup calendar guarantees all those seats and suites will be filled. A NASCAR show is the cornerstone that is placed into the foundation first. While the new tracks in Texas and California are grand examples of NASCAR's future, there are still some shining lights from the past that continue to glow. From the foundation of the sport, short track racing has been the essence of stock car racing. Through the first 250 races in NASCAR's stock car history, all but 20 were competed on dirt tracks, primarily in the South. Building the track specifically for auto racing in the late 40s was a huge risk, but there were some pioneers that were willing to take the challenge.
Joe Littlejohn, Enoch Staley, Paul Sawyer, Clay Earl, and the guys like that is what really made what we got today, because they had a foresight enough to go out and on a limb and gamble and put their money up and go for broke type situation, and that's basically how I think it made it to where it's at today.
When NASCAR ran its first strictly stock car races in 1949, the Martinsville Speedway in Virginia was already 2 years old. Built by Clay Earl, the Speedway is still part of NASCAR's 1998 schedule.
See, after I went with Bill, and when he formed NASCAR, and when he told me he was going to do that, you know, and he asked me if I'd come with him, and I told him I would. And I'd help him in the way I could to build it up, you know, which I did.
Through the years, Martinsville has always been a showplace while hosting every NASCAR-sanctioned series. Also hosting races in NASCAR's inaugural season, the North Wilkesboro Speedway was built by the Staley and Combs families. With its deep moonshine roots, the heritage of the North Carolina region was fast cars and brave drivers.
It's just hard to imagine the love affair that people that grew up in the Appalachian Mountains had with the automobile. I mean, I grew up in the 50s. I was a teenager in the 50s. What a special time that was, you know, with the rock and roll music and with automobiles. And since we had a racetrack there, North Wilkesboro Speedway, that brought in all the big stars, you occasionally got a chance to go watch those guys race those cars against each other. It was a pretty exciting time.
For 48 seasons, North Wilkesboro played host to spectacular racing, and experienced tremendous growth. But in the end, that growth could not keep up with the expansion of the sport. Following the death of founder Enoch Staley, the track was sold, with its new owners taking the Winston Cup dates to their tracks in Texas and New Hampshire, with more attractive markets and greater facilities for sponsors and fans. Richmond, Virginia's heritage is one of strong family convictions. That value system continues today with the Sawyer family and Richmond International Raceway. Led by patriarch Paul Sawyer, the facility is a perfect example of how to adapt to a growing sport. Hosting NASCAR events since 1953, Sawyer faced a crossroads when he saw the sport outgrowing his track built on land owned by the State Fairgrounds Board.
Well, I'm in a minor league facility with a major league sport. I don't have enough seats. It's outdated, old steel guardrail, wooden seats and all, and I gotta go. Either I gotta have a long-term lease.
But Sawyer's stand with the Fairgrounds Board paid off with a new long-term lease that led to the demolition of the old facility and the birth of a new track that he likes to call the 10th wonder of the world, and ensuring his family's place in the future of NASCAR.
How was racing made? It was made on short track, action. And I call this the action track, fan friendly. So I built a 3/4 mile racetrack where everybody could see. And I tell everybody, if I'm doing wrong, let me do it all over again. So if anybody told me it was going to grow as fast as I said, you're crazy. When you're looking at September coming up, 95,800 seats on a 3/4 mile racetrack. And today is the second day of May, and we're sold out. So if you're doing wrong, I want to do it again.
With the stock car racing boom of the 90s, it's hard to believe there was a time that tracks hosting what is now the Winston Cup Series would struggle. But struggle they did. Some gave way to escalating land costs and developers that were anxious to grab valuable commercial property. Some failed due to poor promotion and business practices, and then for some, it was just poor timing. The Langhorne Super Speedway in Pennsylvania was a prestigious stop in NASCAR's earliest seasons. Hosting 17 events over a 9-year span, the unusual design of the track made for a driver's nightmare. It was commonly known as the track that ate its heroes. A circular design that meant the driver was always turning left. Only racing legends could claim victory there, with drivers like Herb Thomas, Dick Rathman, Buck Baker, and Lee Petty among the select few that could say they conquered the great left turn, if only for a day. But even with Langhorne's demise, the design of the track left a lasting impression with Bill France.
He remembered that people didn't care where they sat when they'd walk up to buy the ticket, and he'd never seen that before. And he asked some people, and they said, it doesn't matter, we'll all be on a turn. And that stuck in his mind. And if you think about it, Daytona's tri-oval is kind of a modern end of Langhorne, if you will.
In the late 60s, Detroit industrialist Larry LePayton tried to mix big business and racing in an attempt to operate up to a dozen major racing facilities across the country. His first track was in Michigan, built with $3 million in public stock in his company called American Raceways, Inc. With initial success at Michigan, LePayton next went to Bryan, Texas to build a track that would follow the same design of a 2-mile tri-oval. LePayton was quoted, "I'm profit-oriented, not just dealing at fun and games." If profit was what he was after, he did not find it in racing. Within 3 years, LePayton was out of business. Roger Penske bought the track from bankruptcy court but had reservations about the facility being ready for his first date.
Within 30 days, there was going to be a race, a NASCAR race, and I was concerned at that point, should I really go ahead based on my knowledge of things that I thought should be done before we opened it up to the public under the new ownership. I went back to Indy after we purchased it and ran into Bill France Jr. at the time trials along with Lynn Kukler, and I said, guys, I really don't want to have the race there. I'd really put it off for 4 or 5 months. And they say, Roger, you've got to have it. It was important. Obviously, I didn't know how important it was to their schedule at that point. We went ahead and had that race. It was certainly a keystone decision for the track and for the future. I didn't realize how important that track was going to be as far as NASCAR was concerned.
LePayton's other track in Texas also struggled, fighting a poor location before losing its place on the Winston Cup schedule in 1981. Brickyard owner Tony Holman helped christen Ontario Motor Speedway in 1970. After Indy cars debuted on the layout almost identical to Indianapolis, the track hosted 9 Winston Cup events beginning in 1971 and included the season finale for 7 consecutive seasons. Opinions for the reason for failure of the track are varied, but the consensus seems to lead to one thing: timing.
It was a nice track. It was just before its time. And If it could have lasted till 1983 when television really started, we might not be here today.
I do think another mistake was made. It was a copy of Indianapolis. And you don't copy Fenway Park when you build a new baseball park. You respect what Fenway Park is or Wrigley Field, but you build a new, modern ballpark.
While many tracks came and went from the NASCAR stock car schedule in the first 25 years of the sport, the greatest purge came in 1972. With the entrance of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company into the sport the previous year, it was decided that the years of 50-plus races per season were over. With a concentrated schedule of approximately 30 races per season, each event would take on added significance as well as encouraging all competitors to try to run a full schedule in order to compete for the prestigious title of Winston Cup champion. Following his success with the construction of the Daytona International Speedway, Bill France was looking for another challenge. France claimed an 1,800-acre site in Talladega, Alabama to build his next dream track.
If it was banked a little more, the cars would go faster. If the radius of the turns was a little greater, the cars would go faster. And the track is actually wider than Daytona by 12 feet. And at 2.66, it's longer than Daytona, longer than Indianapolis. In theory, I think he wanted to have the biggest, the fastest racetrack in the world.
As opening day approached in the late summer of 1969, there were dark clouds on the horizon for France. It was a storm that would shake the foundation of NASCAR.
We'd been in Michigan, and all the drivers had got together, most of them, and formed the PDA, Professional Drivers Association, whatever it was. And so, you know, that was just, that had nothing to do with Talladega. We was just wanting to be heard from the driver's standpoint. Anyhow, when we got to Talladega, went down there and started running. They was running right at 200 mile an hour, and the longer we was down there, the worse the tires got.
On Saturday morning, we hadn't planned to go down for qualifying, but we saw all these horror stories about, you know, the tires weren't working, and because they were going so fast and the pavement was new.
And they kept shipping in new tires every day, and we'd put them on and go out and run 3 or 4 laps and tear them off, and they'd bring new ones in the next day, trying to come up with a compound that would work. And it come down to Saturday, and all the drivers got together and said, you know, this is crazy. We're going out there and kill our crazy self.
And I arrived down there Saturday morning. First thing I saw was all these top teams had their cars loaded on their trucks. They didn't have these big fancy trailers back then. And first thing I saw was number 43 on a truck. I said, this doesn't look real good, like he's going to race.
The majority of the drivers thought that it was entirely unsafe.
So we used the PDA to say, okay, as an organization, we're not going to run this race. And France said, you are going to run it. He said, you know, just slow down, you know.
I understand Bill France's situation too. He had a brand new place there. He had to have a show.
We said, France, just, you know, put the race off, give Goodyear and Firestone a time to build a tire that'll stand it, and we'll come back and run. You know, we're not trying to hurt you here. And anyhow, he said, no, said, you're going to run. And so we just loaded our stuff up, and out the gate we went.
Tipped off that there might be trouble, France brought his helmet to Talladega.
Every time I found out something, I would call Bill France and tell him. And these drivers didn't know I was doing that, see? And so France was always a step ahead of them.
So 59-year-old Bill France donned his helmet and took off on the largest American racing oval ever built.
He ran a car 175, I think it was, and there was a tire problem. His theory was that the accelerator goes both ways, you know.
Despite France's exhibition, the drivers still had safety concerns, and the decision was made for most to pull out of the event.
He was a block of granite. I saw that right quick. He said there was going to be a race, and there was. I mean, they waived most of the rules in NASCAR to get a field.
He surprised everyone by making the announcement that he welcomed there to Talladega. He called it the track of the future. he says, appreciate you coming to the race today. You're going to see a good race. And he said, but hold on to your stubs. He said, your stub will be honored for a race at any race at Daytona or any race at Talladega in the future. And the crowd just gave a tremendous roar.
You know, when you look back on all of that, the best thing that ever happened to Talladega, and France got lucky again, and we got lucky, was that for the next 3 or 4 weeks, all you could hear was Talladega. So he got that free publicity that if we went down there and run that race, he'd have got publicity on Monday. On Tuesday, nobody would have known about Talladega.
Just 1 year later, France looked on as Buddy Baker broke the stock car 200-mile-an-hour barrier at Talladega. It was now the world's fastest oval. In 1987, Bill Elliott set a NASCAR qualifying speed mark of 212.809 miles an hour in a Ford Thunderbird. It is a record that still stands today. But with speed comes danger. That same weekend in 1987, Bobby Allison blew a tire that sent him spiraling in the catch fence at over 200 miles an hour.
Bobby Allison with a horrible crash here on the front stretch. It has torn out a complete section of protective railing protecting the crowd from the racetrack, and he came very, very close to going into the stands. The car became airborne and went flying literally into that wall and catch fencing, but fortunately it did stay onto the racetrack.
It was a crash that changed the course of history of superspeedway racing. NASCAR mandated a restrictor plate be placed on the engines to slow the cars down at Daytona and Talladega, keeping speeds below the 200-mile-per-hour mark. A rule implemented for the safety of drivers and spectators that fails to dampen the passion that is felt by everyone for Talladega. The images from the most intimidating venue only begin to tell a story of what the competition is really like. It's all that Bill France Sr. could have envisioned for his ever-growing sport. If Bill France was truly inspired to build his superspeedway at Daytona following his expulsion from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it is doubly ironic that the racing series he created would enjoy one of its milestone events when in 1994, NASCAR came calling with the first Brickyard 400. The first inkling that stock cars may be coming to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway came in 1991, when A.J. Foyt piloted his car around the world-famous oval while they're filming a commercial. Speedway president Tony George also took a turn at the wheel and found the match of stock cars and the Brickyard to be more than just a pipe dream. As negotiations between the Speedway and NASCAR continued, there were a few more parties that needed to be consulted.
I was at Goodyear at the time, and Bill France called me one day and he says, how'd you like to do a tire test at Indianapolis? I said, well, I don't want to, why would I do a tire test at Indianapolis? And he said, well, you never know when there might be a race down there. And I said, well, I'd like to do a tire test of Indianapolis, but not just for showbiz. I mean, I don't want to go down there unless there's going to be a race. Is there going to be a race? He said, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that. We just want to figure out what's going on. So I said, it's going to cost me a lot of money. He says, it won't cost you anything. It's going to be a tire test. So we came down, and I think whatever, it's kind of historical now, 30 or 40,000 people came out to watch a tire test, which we thought was a great value. But I think that was like everything else. It was very carefully thought out.
With the behind-the-scenes work done, it was time for a monumental announcement to be made.
Yeah, you talk about breaking tradition. They're going to be doing it next summer. It's official. The good old boys will soon become the Indy boys.
It is now official. The Winston Cup drivers will race at Indy. They'll do it next year.
Officials have announced that there will be a NASCAR event run August 6th of 1994 in Indianapolis. It will be known as the Brickyard 400.
The real big story today is NASCAR racing going to go to one of the most famous tracks in all the world, and it has a whole lot of people excited.
There will be a NASCAR Winston Cup stock car event here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, August 4th, 5th, 6th, 1994.
With a sellout in less than 10 days, the event was an incredible success. An enthusiastic crowd enjoyed perfect weather and a finish that had all of the elements of a Hoosier fairy tale.
Jeff Gordon is about to write his name in the racing history books. Years from today, when 79 stock car races have been run here, we'll remember the name. Jeff Gordon, winner of the inaugural Brickyard 400.
It was a feather in the cap, NASCAR, to run at what is arguably the world's most famous race course. No question about it. But more than a feather in the cap, Bill Jr. viewed it as a tremendous thing for his athletes, many of whom, Darrell Waltrip and I drove around Indianapolis years ago when I was managing the place, and he just salivated at the idea of racing at Indianapolis. But he was a stock car driver. And Bill felt that his athletes and car owners and so on deserved to run at the world's most famous speedway. And so he was delighted to be able to, from the NASCAR standpoint, put the race together.
The most famous race course in the world had hosted the greatest stock car series in the world, a match that Big Bill would have been proud to have seen. NASCAR had come full circle.
Continue watching for extended interviews with NASCAR legends that are included exclusively with this commemorative video.
Tony Hallman came to Ontario to see the stock car race, openly talked, not to the press, but talked about maybe we'll have one sometime. He had serious discussions with Charlie Brockman, then the president of USAC, about a stock car race. Never got around to doing much about it, and then unfortunately he passed away. And when I came in there to manage the Speedway in '79, one of the things that was clear was that if the Speedway was to expand and build more seats and suites and all of that, it needed some other revenue streams. And the only other revenue stream that made sense was a NASCAR Winston Cup race. So we began looking at how that would work. For instance, we knew we didn't want it to be a 500-mile race for obvious reasons. We didn't have garages that they could use. We didn't have a lot of things. And Bill France Jr. and I spent a long afternoon and into the evening making a list on a long yellow pad of the things that would need to be done at the Speedway. Well, the Speedway family, if you will, was not quite ready to focus on it in the early '70s. Tony was still in college, Tony George. But as soon as Tony got there, he began to put the wheels in motion to do the things that were necessary to have a stock car race. For the pure and simple reason that here's the world's most famous race course, and it has no revenue stream except the month of May. And you can't continue to build steel and concrete and glass grandstands and suites and all those things that are out there now if you don't have revenue. So almost from the day he got there, he and I would have chats about what I had done a few years earlier to get ready, and then Bill got into it from their standpoint, from an operational standpoint. For instance, a way had to be worked out to bring gasoline from the tanks to the pits. You know the situation there. Well, a way was worked out. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but Tony grabbed a hold of it and committed to doing it, and it was an enormous success. It is an enormous success, as you know. You can't get a ticket. And the races have been exciting. Nobody ever planned for a high school kid in Pittsburgh to win the first race, but he did, and what a way to start it off.
First Southern 500 to me was remarkable in that it attracted drivers from as far away as California. And a Californian won the race, Johnny Mance. There were a tremendous number of cars in the race, and there were all kinds of great stories about tires and so forth. I would like to have been there. I was at Darlington later that year for the IndyCar race on the 7th of December. I went down there for that event. That was my first trip to Darlington, and I tell you, it was culture shock. It really was. they had a cocktail party, which they called a cocktail party, a reception. It was in a tobacco warehouse that had no tobacco in it, but it had huge bags of peanuts. Each bag was the size of a double bed, and lining the walls of this warehouse. And in the middle of this floor was a couple of cinder blocks, on top of which was a 45-gallon drum and a little fire under it, and some gruel was simmering in there, which was the hors d'oeuvres. And they ladled this stuff out, and I didn't know what it was. And I asked what it was, and it was told that it was catfish stew, which I had never had before, and never since, thank you. Anyway, during the course of the evening, a shot rings out. And turn around, there's a guy with a pistol in his hand, saying that he'd seen a rat scampering down the side of these peanut bags. This is a real civilized town, Ridgewood. And I'd never seen anybody do anything like that outside of in a military uniform. And to make a long story short, during the course of the evening, the announcer, 20 Grand Steinbach, who loved free drinks, collapsed and passed out on the floor. And we all stepped over him. Nobody paid any attention to him. He was just sleeping it off. And finally the party wound down and people left. And I was there with Frank Mahalik, who was Sam Nunes' press agent. And here's the unconscious announcer on the floor. So we picked him up and threw him in my car, which was a new 1949 Ford, and took him to his hotel and deposited him in his room. And the next morning, I picked up the Indianapolis winner, Johnny Parsons, to take him to the track, and he got in the back seat of my car, and he said to me, "Whose are they?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "On the floor." And I leaned over and looked in the back, and there on the floor was a full set of uppers and lowers. And I get to the track, and here's 20 Grand with his hat on and his collar off, saying, "Where were they?" It was really my most vivid Darlington memory.
It was different from what we had been running. We'd been running on, flat tracks and stuff like that. Very few racetracks. Darlington, I think, was the biggest bank racetrack we ran. But I was probably the luckiest person at Daytona when I won that race, because my car was very, very far from being competitive, and it just happened to be that we was stacked up against them high-powered Pontiacs at that time, and luckily I went out one time and Cotton Owens was going out, and I just said, well, I'm going to tag along and see just about how bad he can outrun me. And he started pulling away from me, and then all of a sudden the cars kind of eagled out, and then all of a sudden I drove right back up to him. And I thought Ray had done something to the car, that really made it run a whole lot better, and so on and so forth. So I come back in and kind of questioned Ray Fox about, well, what did you do to the car to make it run as fast as it's running now? He said, I ain't done nothing to it. Well, the next guy I went out with, I waited till I tag along with Jack Smith. He come along one of them Pontiacs, and I picked him up, and so it's the same thing with him. Well, I went back in and I told Ray, I said, I'll tell you one thing, I figured out they ain't gonna outrun me today. We might blow up or something, or they'll sling this thing all to pieces, because it's turning like 1,000 RPMs more than it was supposed to. And that was probably where the drafting was come from, is just by a stroke of luck, me trying to figure out how to run with them boys. I picked up on it, and that's basically how I won that race.
In our day, we had the windows were all closed, completely closed, so you couldn't hear nothing. And if you opened the window, you lost speed. And I mean, they were sealed off completely, these cars. And the T-Bird was like a subframe the T-Bird had. And I need to tell you about this one. So in this, I think it was a consolation race or something like that, Tommy Irwin, there's a lake in the middle of this racetrack. Tommy Irwin went in the lake, and we couldn't figure out what happened. And he stood down there for quite a long time. And so after he come out, we found out what happened. See, the crank handle on the windshield, on the side glass, fell off, and he couldn't crank the window down, so he couldn't get out of the car. So he had to unhook himself and look inside this here car for the crank handle. And then he finally found the crank handle, stuck it back on this door, and rolled the window down and came out. And then I says, that's it, because I can't swim, and I'm deathly scared of water. So that's the day I went out and bought a life jacket and an aqua lung, and I did. I wore the life jacket in that race, and I had an aqua lung in the car, you know, because I definitely was not going in that lake, you know, without that there life jacket on. And but nobody believed me, but they all saw me wearing it.
I was home getting my old car ready to go to Charlotte, and Ray Fox went to Charlotte without a driver. And Junior Johnson, I think, drove his car a time or two. And back that time, they had, I think, qualifying races, something like that. So Bud Moore and Joe Littlejohn and maybe Cotton, I don't know who all talked to Ray and told him they ought to give me a chance and let me drive the car, because, you know, like I say, he didn't have nobody to drive. And they told him that they thought I could drive the car, you know, and do a good job. So they called me and asked me about it, and I said, Lord, yeah. And I just throwed everything down and quit right then. I said, yeah, I'll drive, you know, Ray's car, because I knew it was a good car and what you might say, a factor-back car, you know, and it was a Pontiac. So I went to Charlotte, and I never will forget it. When I went out and practiced, come back in, Ray said, how does it feel? I said, tell you the truth, I don't know how it's supposed to feel. I've never run this fast before in my life, you know. So, but anyway, I don't reckon we ever even touched the car. But Junior Johnson had drove the car and set it up a little bit, you know, for him, and told him that he was going to drive it in the qualifying races. So Junior run third, I believe it was, second, third. Anyway, I started third in the car. And so luckily, I won the race. And in fact, I think I blew a tire. I finished on the flat tire, right rear tire. And I didn't know how far ahead I was, but come find out, I think I was about 7 laps ahead. And when I blew the tire, but Ray and Evan never did tell me how fast. I mean, they always told me every lap how fast I was running by holding up a board, you know, and they'd write the speed on it. But they never did tell me I was that many laps ahead or anything. So when I had the flat tire, I thought that was it. So I blew the tire going down the back stretch. So coming off 4, I seen the guy get the white flag, and so I knew then that I was leading the race, you know, but I didn't know how far ahead I was. So I just said, I'm gonna keep it going. Maybe I'll finish pretty good anyway. So Fireball running second, and he lapped me 2 or 3 times. I don't know how many times while I was going around. And coming off of 4, the guy was still waving the white flag. So when I got there and I got to checker, that was the biggest thrill I guess I've ever had in my life.
Well, we'd been working with Plymouth all the years and Chrysler, and then Dodge decided to come out with a wing Dodge Daytona for I guess 1969, and so you know we went to Plymouth and said, well, are we going to get a wing car? And they said no. I said, well, just give me a Dodge then. That's okay, you know, I'm okay. No, you can't have a Dodge. You're a Plymouth man. You got to have a Plymouth. I said, you mean I got to run a stock Plymouth against that thing with a wing on it? And they said, yeah, but said you can do it, you know. I said, I ain't going to do it, you know. And I said, well, give me a Dodge. And they said no. And I said, well, I'm not going to run a Plymouth. And I said, I'll just go over and talk to the Ford people. Yeah, go on, you know, one of those kind of deals like. So I did. And so we wound up with a Ford. So in '69 we ran the Ford, and then about halfway through the '69 season, in fact about June, Chrysler contacted me and come back and said, if we build a Plymouth with a wing on it, will you come back? And I said, yeah, I will. So that's where the '70 Superbird came from.